This video is about Puyo attacking theory, and what I mean by that is it's just going to be theory about what's supposed to happen at a high level and how things are supposed to play out, and it's not going to describe how you actually do it in a game, like how would you build attacks or things like that. And it can always be affected by different things like it may not play out how it's actually theoretically supposed to play out due to the random colors or players don't always make the optimal decisions or things like that. Now, to start out, I'm going to talk about clearing Puyo efficiently. Now, as most people probably know, clearing the longest chain possible is the most efficient way to send garbage, but it might be surprising just how large the difference gets at the really high chain lengths. So, for example, if you're clearing 40 Puyo, and you make a 10 chain, so that's perfect for every link, you're going to end up sending 526 garbage to the opponent. But if you only clear a 9 and a 1 chain, which is also 40 Puyo, that ends up being 398 garbage, which is over 100 less than a 10 chain. And you would have to get a 9 chain plus another 6 chain to get just about the same as a 10 chain by itself. And if you broke it up in a 5 and 5 chain, that's only 138 garbage, and that's way less than 526. You would need about a big 7 chain and another big 7 chain to get the same size. Now, power chains get pretty close in power as a regular chain, so by power chain I mean the matches at the end have extra Puyo disappearing or have multiple different colors disappearing at the same time. So if you send a 9 double where 2 different colors disappear at the same time, that would be 511, and that's very close to a 10 chain. And if you add more power with like more than 4 Prio disappearing in the last link, it would get even closer or more powerful. So the big takeaway here is if you send the longest chain, you're probably going to win, and power chains get close to a long chain. But if you send the longest chain, you're probably going to win because you're going to send so much more that the follow-up chain that the opponent needs to be really big just to catch up. So with that in mind, let's talk about attacking and extending. So in the time it takes to send one chain link, you can place almost 2 pieces down. So if you're playing at full speed and not splitting, you can almost get 2 pieces down in the time it takes to send one chain link in a chain. So for example, while a 9 chain pops, I'm going to reduce that number to about 1.7 to account for like not always being perfect speed and perfect efficiency. So let's say you place 1.7 pieces per each link. That means you can place almost 15 pieces, and that's almost 7.5 chain links that you can extend your own chain in the time it takes for the 9 chain to disappear. So now think about this situation where 2 players have 9 chains set up, and one player attacks with a 2 double, which uses up 3 links, and then the other person just sends their 9 chain to counter it. You might think that's pretty good, but in theory, the person who sent the 9 chain is probably going to lose because the other player now is able to extend a theoretical 7.5 chain links if they play really well, and they could make a 13.5 chain. So they're going to get the biggest chain, and they're probably going to win. So this is an example of how far a player could theoretically extend, and maybe even a little bit more, because you can get close to 2 pieces per chain link. But something like this, go from here, make a 2 double, and extend to this much in the time it takes for a 9 chain to disappear. And then they would have such a lead in the garbage that it would take such a big chain to counter it back. So now the big takeaway is, if you can force your opponent to use a big chain first, you often gain an advantage because in the time it takes for that chain to disappear, you can out-extend them and send the biggest chain yourself. So um, now you know attacking often results in advantage if you can force the opponent to send a big chain, but that's not always true. And for cases where that's not true, I'm calling it an all-in attack. So, an all-in attack would be where if the opponent starts their big chain, their main chain, because in most rounds, both players are just going to have a big main chain that they're steadily building up. So if you do an all-in attack, the opponent can send their main chain and have a near guaranteed win because you won't be able to outextend them. So an all-in attack occurs if you attack without that many resources behind. So either you're behind in resources or um, you just haven't built up that much yet. If you attack in situations like that, it's going to be hard to catch up and outextend the opponent. Or if you use too many resources in your attack, so if you have if both players have 7 chains built up and you attack with a 5 chain, now you're just being inefficient because they're using too much. And then if the opponent sends a 7 chain, you're not going to be able to, you're only going to have 2 chains left behind or 8 Puyo, and you're not going to be able to outextend past their 7 chain in most situations. So that can be another way to be all in when you attack. Or if your attack makes it so that you can't use the rest of the Puyo on your field, then that's probably an all in attack as well. And there's an example of that on the right where this is a 2 double attack, so it's very strong and fast, but it's probably an all in attack because the way the form is now, it's going to be very hard to use all the colors in a follow up attack if the opponent sends a big chain. So this is probably an all in attack. And then if you're not able to extend fast enough or efficiently enough, then any attack you send is probably all in as well. Now, a big point to remember is that all in doesn't mean bad or cheap or unfair or anything like that. It doesn't have any negative connotations associated with it. So it's just to say that if you do an all in attack, the opponent can counter with their main chain and they should win. But there are plenty of situations where you might want to do an all in attack because you see your opponent has a weakness, like they need a whole bunch of colors to be able to set off any chain, and you don't have any small attack, but you might be able to go in with an all-in attack and then just win the round that way because you know the opponent's not going to be able to counter. So it can be a very useful thing to do as well. So in cases where you're doing an all-in attack, countering with a large chain is going to result in a win, as opposed to just the regular case where if you force your opponent to use a big chain, you gain the advantage. Now, a lot of times it's not actually very clear and it's more of a probability thing. So instead of being clearly all in or clearly winning for you after you attack, it's more like you have a big advantage because it's pretty easy to outextend the opponent, or you have a big disadvantage because it's very hard to outextend the opponent, but maybe you could if you get the perfect extension off, things like that. So it's less of a perfect distinction and more of a kind of probability scale. So talking more about that balance though, um, if you do really early attacks, they're usually going to be all in because they're not going to have that many resources. But sometimes if they're super early and or super efficient, then they can be not all in, and sometimes they can just be a straight advantage for you. So if you send like a 2 triple at the very start and clear almost everything, then even if the opponent sends a 4 chain, sometimes the 4 chain isn't even enough, or sometimes the 4 chain just barely counters, but the 2 triple is so much faster that you still have an advantage. So if it's super early, a lot of times it's not clear and it's even, or you might even get an advantage with an early attack. But besides that, if you do an early attack, usually it's going to be an all-in attack. And then attacks that are really large or break up your own form, those are usually all-in attacks. And a big point is it depends on your skill level, so you have to be really strong yourself in order to attack and then outextend the opponent. And if you're slower or less efficient than your opponent at all, then a lot more of your attacks are going to be all in just because you're not going to have the resources to outextend them. And the farther you are from a perfect extension rate, the more attacks become all in. So even if you're quite strong at the game, you're probably not going to be able to extend 7 links in the time a 9 chain is disappearing consistently, unless you're like maybe a top pro or something. Maybe they can get it, but a lot of strong players still aren't going to be able to do that. So if you can only extend like 2 or 3 links while a 9 chain is going, then if you send a 2 double, that's using 3 links. So you're already like right at the all-in line, and you're not really gaining an advantage by making the opponent play a main chain. So it is heavily dependent on how well you can um, place Puyo quickly and use them efficiently. Now, at a high level, though, you can do a lot of big attacks, like 4, 5, or 6 chains, without being all in if there's enough Puyo on the field. So, like if they're built up to an 11 or 12 chain or 10 chain or close to that, they can attack with like 4 or 5 or 6 chains, and if the opponent sends that 10 or 11 chain, um, the person who attacked can often just outextend them and still win. Now, in order to avoid the disadvantage from using a big chain, the best way to do that is to counter. So instead of countering with a full chain, by counter I mean you make a slightly larger chain than the opponent sent, and then you use that to clear the garbage and send a little bit more garbage back to the opponent. So now the person countering is doing the attacking, but they have a lot more potential power and a lot more effectiveness because, for example, if someone attacks with a 3 chain, they have to use 12 Puyo to send 14 garbage. And if it gets countered by a 4 chain, like minimum 3 chain versus a minimum 4 chain, then the fourth link by itself is 18 garbage. So the first 3 counter the 3 chain, and then the fourth goes back to the opponent. But now you're clearing 4 Puyo to send 18 garbage to the opponent, where the opponent had to clear 12 Puyo to send 14 garbage initially. And that's because the higher chain links are just that much more powerful. So you get to counter with the same amount and then access the higher chain links and send a whole bunch more garbage a lot more efficiently. So countering with a slightly larger chain is a very strong play. And if the opponent can't counter back themselves and they have to send their main chain, they're sending a big chain now, and it's going to be very easy to out-extend them. Like in this case, you would only have to extend 2 links to out-extend them because you only sent 1 more link in your attack. So that's why countering is a really strong play, and it's what you're going to see the top players go for most of the time. Now, the same all-in rules do apply to counters as well, if the opponent has resources left to send a big chain. So if you use too many Puyo in your counter, or like use break up your form when you make your counter, or do things like that, then your counter is going to be all in, so it's like a counter all in, and then the opponent can just send their main chain that they still have if they didn't do an all in attack themselves, and then they're going to probably win because you won't be able to catch up and outextend them. So just as attacks can be all in, counters can be all in too. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about resource advantages. So resource advantage could occur just due to speed or efficiency differences, where one player might place Puyo in positions where they're really hard to use, and that's kind of just losing resources. Or one player just might be slower than the other, and that loses resources due to that. And then Another way a resource advantage could come up is if you make a lot of inefficient clears, like if you clear a bunch of one chains that don't send any garbage, then not only are you like losing time, like the time it takes for the one chain to disappear, you're also clearing out some of your own resources when you make the one chain disappear, so that's already a loss of for Puyo on your side of the field. So it's losing resources in multiple ways. And then also attacking is also just losing resources. So you're going to be at a resource disadvantage if you attack and the opponent just receives the garbage. And then if you keep on attacking, that disadvantage gets even larger. So if you're at a resource advantage, you're pretty free to just attack as you want because most attacks you do aren't going to be all in, and if the opponent counters with a big chain, it should be pretty easy to outextend them. So if you have that advantage, you're kind of free to do whatever you want. But if you're at the disadvantage, it becomes a lot harder because if you attack at all, it's probably going to be all in, and the opponent can just use their main chain and win. So you have to be really careful about attacking, and you only want to attack if you believe the opponent can't set off a big chain at that moment. Or you have to just build up, and you're going to be behind in resources if both players are playing at the same speed from then on. So you're going to be slightly behind, but if you can just counter any attacks that come, then you'll have the chance to build up yourself and catch up in the end. Now, a similar idea is space advantage. So, if the opponent attacks and you receive garbage, you're going to be at a resource advantage, like I said, but you're going to be at a space disadvantage because you're going to have all that garbage on your side of the field. So, in situations where your chain is still accessible, so you're not like covered and completely blocked off and going to lose, then the opponent is now just behind in resources, but they have that space advantage. So, how a situation like that should play out is the side with garbage is going to want to attack to clear the garbage, and um, they're going to want to use that resource advantage in an attack, and then at the same time clear out garbage so that they can have more space to build a larger chain. And if they if they receive garbage but then they just instantly send their main chain because it's still accessible, a lot of times that's just going to lose because the other player is going to outextend it. And on the other hand, if you're the side without any garbage, you don't want to follow up attack very quickly because you're already behind in resources, so it's going to be just all in if the opponent has their main chain accessible. So you don't want to attack, you just want to build up and catch up in resources and then use the extra space to win because you can outextend the opponent because you have extra space. But you have to be ready to counter the incoming attack that you expect because the side with the garbage is expected to try to attack and use the extra resources and clear out space. And then, like I was saying, you don't want to follow up attack if they have a big chain available because you're just going to lose to it and you'll use too many resources and you probably won't be able to outextend them. Now, here's an interesting idea that you might not know about, and I'm calling it the one chain meta. So, while you're playing, you're building up points towards your next attack. So, anytime you press down, you get points for dropping Puyo quickly, and then at a high level, you're almost always just holding down. So, you're building up points, and those points actually go into your next attack. So, if you were to send a one chain at the very start of a game, it's not actually going to send any garbage, but after you place a whole bunch of pieces quickly and you build up points with its soft drop bonus, but you build up points, then you can send 3 to 4 garbage with just a one chain, even without any power to it. Like it just clears 4 Prio, it's not a double match or anything like that. Just a normal one chain can send like 3 or 4 garbage, and maybe 5. I'm not sure how big it gets, but I'm calling this a boosted one chain, and it's actually really powerful because that 4 or 5 garbage can cover a critical spot on the opponent's field. So a lot of times, once they're getting high up, um, someone might be looking to set off a really big chain. Like, say this player has this perfect chain and it's really big, and they're right about to set it off, and then you send that one chain, and that just covers the perfect spot. And it's like, oh, I just got so unlucky that this one garbage covered the spot. But it's actually a strategy that people go for. So um, you actually a lot of times people try to time that one chain and try to get it to cover a critical spot. And then something you might not think about is when you make that one chain, that's a perfect opportunity to just take the extra time to watch your opponent and see what their field looks like and process like what do they have on their field and things like that. Because you know you're going to make the one chain and it's going to take time to clear, so you can use that time to check out the opponent's screen. It's also very low commitment and low risk, so you're not like um, taking a big risk by making one chain that might get countered. Even if they counter it, you're going to have time to um, do something back, like counter the counter, because the one chain is just so quick and it's hard to react to. So, like, if you don't see it coming and just out of the blue, there's a one chain with 4 garbage, it can just you might just not be able to do anything. So a lot of times pros know about this, and they're going to be um, depending on who's playing. Some people look for it more than others, but they're going to be looking for when to use that one chain, and sometimes you're going to see like the one chain gets countered by a one chain, or like the one chain gets countered by a two chain because the other player knew that it was about time for a one chain, so they made a two chain instead to counter the opponent's one chain. You'll see things like that happening. Now, another interesting idea is combination attacks. And so, in this example, the player on the left has this really nice, really powerful, really good-looking attack, and it's going to send 45 garbage. But unfortunately for them, the player on the right has a 4-chain counter that's going to counter it perfectly. So it wouldn't be smart to just do this attack because it's going to get countered. But if you do a combination attack, like you do a small and fast attack first, that can either block an important point for the opponent, or it can force them into using something first, and then you can counter the counter. So, you, again, you can either block them or make them do something that you can counter. So, let's say the player on the left instead made the small 2-chain first. Now the opponent either has to react with like that 4-chain, and then the player on the left will have time to adjust their chain and build a bigger chain or start their main chain. This shape is actually kind of hard to do that with, but in theory, you would be able to do it. And then if they don't counter it, they're going to get some garbage, and it's probably going to block this spot, and then you can use your big attack right after, and they probably aren't going to be able to clear the garbage fast enough and start their counter. So even though they have the perfect counter there, you can use a small attack first to try to either force them to use it too early, or block it off and then get the win that way. So that's an example of like how you might use a combination attack. Now there's one more thing that combination attacks can be used for, and it's this idea called an interrupt. In Japanese they call it warikomi. But so in Puyo Puyo 2, you have until the time when your opponent's chain ends to counter all the garbage. And as long as you send more garbage than you receive during that time, then you won't receive any garbage at all. And that seems pretty natural. But original Puyo Puyo didn't have that, just any garbage that you got sent was guaranteed to fall on your side of the screen because there was no countering at all. But Sue adds countering, so as long as you send something before their chain ends, you start countering, and then if it's more garbage than you received, you counter it all. But an interesting quirk is that garbage is actually cleared from the most recently sent garbage, not the earliest sent garbage. So it's kind of counterintuitive because let's take this example. The first player sends a 3 chain that sends 28 garbage, and then the second player counters with a 4 chain that's 32 garbage. So it would clear all of it, and you wouldn't get any garbage. You would be able to play normally. But let's say right after sending the 3 chain, the person sends a 9 chain, and then the person who sent the 4 chain sent it at the very end of the 3 chain. So what would actually happen is, as after the player starts the 9 chain, then the garbage from the 4 chain is going to go to clearing the 9 chain because it's the most recently sent garbage, and then anything extra will go to the original 3 chain. So um, they're going to send a 9 chain, but it's not going to be 9 immediately. It goes 1, 2, 3 up to 9. So it would go through the smaller garbage amounts first. So in that way, the 4 chain would probably go over most of it, but it would still go to the what's being sent most recently first. So how the numbers would look is like, so it's 28 garbage, and then you're countering with the 4 chain. So you start countering, and there's your 1, and it goes into the first attack. But immediately after, the player sends their 9 chain, and then so they get their 1, and you get your 2, which is 5 garbage. But your 1 of that 5 has to go to countering the first link in the 9 chain, and only 4 of it goes into the first attack. And then now it's chain 2, link 2 versus link 3, so it's 5 versus 9. So 5 of that 9 has to go into countering the second link in the 9 chain, and the other 4 can go into the first attack. And now link 3 and link 4, 18, like 9 of the 18 garbage has to go into countering the third link in the 9 chain, and the other 9 can go into the first attack. So you would think, if you didn't know about this, that since you sent a 4 chain, you'll clear all the garbage from that 3 chain, and then you'll have an opportunity to send a bigger chain afterwards. But that's not how it actually works, because you get interrupted, and you actually, in this case, would end up with 10 garbage still, and that 10 garbage is going to fall immediately when your chain ends, because you didn't counter the 3 chain all the way. So you're actually going to get almost 2 lines of garbage, even though you sent enough to counter it. And that's how interrupt works. So interrupt is actually really powerful when you can pull it off. And a lot of times, if you have a strong combination attack, that's a situation where you can take advantage of the interrupt system, because you can send the one attack and send a really fast follow-up that can interrupt the counter. And so that's what I just said. A lot of times it's from a combination attack, or if the opponent takes a really long time to start a counter, like if they don't draw the color to start the counter immediately, they might have to put down a bunch of extra pieces, and then they finally draw it. And then sometimes, like, the opponent might hesitate because they don't know where to start a counter, because they have to do something complicated or unusual and take even longer. And in situations like that, interrupt is very much in play, because you can start your chain first, and then if their chain doesn't have any power to it, they aren't going to be able to go over your second chain, so they're guaranteed to get the garbage from the first chain. And a lot of times it's just a pretty guaranteed losing situation, because like in this example, if you receive 10 pieces of garbage right after your 4 chain ends, you're going to get covered so much that you're almost guaranteed to have to eat the 9 chain as well, unless you built a setup that can take the garbage and still set off your main chain. So because you get interrupted, you get some garbage from the first attack, and you're probably going to have to take the garbage from the second attack too and lose. And you can use your main chain to interrupt sometimes. Usually that happens in the situation I was talking about where it takes a long time for the person to start the counter, then you might just use your main chain. So if you're watching a match being played and you see someone do an attack and then just immediately send their main chain in a way that looks kind of unusual, they're probably going for an interrupt. And then that falling garbage doesn't necessarily have to be a lot, like just a little bit of garbage can block a critical spot, and it also reduces draws that you get because it takes time for the garbage to fall. So in that time, you can't draw any extra Puyo, and that might prevent you from drawing the piece you need to start your chain. So interrupt is actually a really strong technique, one you can pull it off, but it doesn't apply all the time. So in summary, first of all, the biggest chain usually wins, just because of how much extra power the big links get. Then, if you send a big chain first, though, you usually lose because the other player gets to send a bigger chain than you because they can extend while your chain is going. And then attacking becomes really powerful because you either win by burying your opponent in garbage, or you can force them to send the big chain first and then outextend them. But some attacks are going to be all in. Like if you use too many Puyo or break up your form too much, then your attack is probably all in, and in those situations, the opponent can use a really big chain and still win. Now, countering is even more powerful than attacking because the counter has much higher potential power than the original attack because it has access to those higher chain links. But you can also be counter all in too. Now, if you have less space because you got garbage, but more resources because you didn't send any Prio to attack with, then in that situation, you want to attack to gain that space back and use up your extra resources effectively. Now, boosted one chains are really powerful, and that's when you're holding down the whole game, so you gain points, and then you don't clear anything, so all those points go into your next one chain. And it can actually send almost a line and cause a major problem for the opponent or just make them fill up when they're really high up. And then combination attacks are really powerful because they can either force the opponent to play a move first and then you counter it, or they can prevent your opponent from countering your next attack. And then interrupt is a nice technique to know about and understand, where if you send garbage in one attack and then send another attack immediately, they start clearing from the second attack first, and then if any garbage in the first attack is left over, they're going to still get garbage from it, even if they had enough to counter it. So that's all I have for this Puyo attacking theory video. I hope it's useful.